One of the things that I've been very closely aligned with and connected to, one of my previous books actually, my second book was called Firing on All Cylinders, and came out in the late 80s, early 90s, as we were in the midst in the Achieve group of working with quite a number of different firms across North America, around the world, around service and quality improvement. So it was around the time of the TQM, continuous quality improvement kind of work. And we built a framework around a lot of that process and a lot of that implementation. And I want to just quickly highlight what many of you are probably familiar with, because that quality revolution, which has kind of morphed into different phases with re-engineering a few years later, and then with Six Sigma and various other phases that it's gone through, you see the principles continuing to get deeper and deeper and deeper into our thinking and into our psyche, especially in production kinds of organizations, and more recently in service kinds of organizations as well. And I think it's useful to kind of revisit the change in thinking that went on in North America, or that has gone on, especially in the last 20 years ago, because if we were together here 20 years ago, which was about the last time I was in Fort McMurray when I lived in Edmonton for a few years, I actually was working at that time with Culligan Water Conditioning. I was a Hay Culligan man, and we opened an office here in Fort McMurray back in about 80 or 81. And so around about that time, you recall, we're in the midst of a major recession, and our manufacturing sector, particularly our automotive and electronics manufacturing center, was getting beat up very badly, especially by the Japanese. And they were, ironically, using principles that had started in America, and then we started to substitute, or started in North America, we started to substitute here in North America throughout the go-go years of the 50s, 60s, 70s. We began to substitute quantity for quality. We began to develop a mindset that basically said, well, if that car or if that product rolling down the line isn't quite up to snuff, we'll just inspect it, get rid of it, and build another one. Got lots more where that came from. And that kind of thinking permeated deep into our management thinking. And so the Japanese came along using techniques that had originated from people like W. Edwards Deming, the statistician, Joseph Duran, the engineer, who went over to Japan after the Second World War and helped rebuild the economy where they really had nothing and had to really start from scratch and didn't have the luxury of quantity, had to really figure out how can we build this right the first time. So you know some of this story. And you know, for example, that one of the big shifts in thinking was moving away from this notion of acceptable quality level. Saying, well, there's some level of defect that's kind of the acceptable level of defect. So it might be 99% or 98 or 2% or 1% or 0.5%, but there's some level of defect that's okay. And changing that to the notion of zero defects. And that's where some of you may have read Phil Crosby's book, Quality is Free. All of that thinking was around, well, if we get to the level of zero defects, we're going to have a lot of different benefits that come from that. Some of you may have heard the famous story as well around that time of the electronics manufacturer in North America who was subcontracting some components to some Japanese firms. And they told them that the acceptable quality level was whatever it was, a 1% defect rate, we'll say. And they received the first shipment, and there was this odd little box with it, with a special little note. And so they open it up, and in it it said, we don't understand your strange American ways, but here's the 1% defective parts that you asked for. And of course they ripped open and they thoroughly inspected all the rest of the shipment, and it was absolutely perfect. But there were the 1% defects. And that was one of the big shifts in thinking that began. You may remember Deming came out with a video in 1981 that was called If Japan Can, Why Can't We? And it really kicked off the revolution, especially in the automotive sector, to change our thinking. To begin to realize that we are expecting quality problems. We are saying it's okay to have quality problems. And of course the same thing applies. You can see the parallels now when we start talking about safety. Blaming and exhorting was another, and of course Deming was especially angry and would get really passionate about how often we blame the workforce and blame workers Some of you may know of his famous rad bead experiment, where you would have rad beads and a bunch of other beads and a little paddle, wooden paddle with indents in it, and you were supposed to pick up no rad beads at all. Well, of course, you went through and they charted carefully, and the deviations went up and down, and in the end, it became clear that this was a fixed game. There was no possible way that you couldn't have some rad beads. And of course, the point that he was making was that it's in the system, it's in the process, and that we've got to look deeper. Management is all about the head. It's planning, analysis, control, systems, processes, all vitally important. Leadership is all about the heart. It's feelings, it's emotions, it's connectedness, it's sense of respect or values that I get. It's much more intangible, which is one of the reasons why sometimes managers say, you got to get rid of that stuff. Business is business, right? Got to leave the personal feelings out of it. Got to leave all the emotion out of it. It's business here. And let's not get all this tangled up together. Well, the fact is, we aren't automatrons that can sort of shut off our emotions when we go to work. We bring those along with us. It's part of the whole package that we all have. And as much as we might try to deny our emotions, shut them down, we obviously can't really do that. And so we need to deal with the whole person, first as ourselves and then with others in our organization. One of the newer areas of research that I think has been exciting that illustrates these two areas more is IQ and EQ. How many of you are familiar with some of the emotional intelligence research that's coming out? Some of you are. I think it's very, very powerful research that's beginning to show that it is the leadership dimension or the emotional dimensions that make the huge difference in our effectiveness in life and in our teams and in our organizations. Very quick synopsis of one study that was done at Harvard. They took a look at the medical school, the law school, and business schools, and they went back 20, 30, 40 years, and they examined the entrance exams, which are really a surrogate for IQ testing. And they tried to figure out, is there a correlation here? Did the brightest people end up being the most successful in their careers and in their lives? And so they tracked down a lot of those people. There were hundreds of them in this study. And they studied them, talked to their peers, talked to family, got them to do self-assessment. And what they actually found in a number of cases was a negative correlation. The brightest people were actually less successful than those who weren't quite as bright, but were very high on the EQ dimension, on the EQ side of things. At University of Berkeley, California, they did a similar study of PhD scientists. In fact, similar studies have been done of Nobel Prize-winning scientists to say, well, surely the brightest ones are the most successful. Well, obviously, to be a PhD scientist takes a certain level of IQ. But what the research found is once you get to that club, once you get to that level, IQ is a horrible predictor of success. It has zero, or in some cases even, again, negative correlations with success. EQ is a much better predictor by a factor in that study of 4 times. Over a 40-year period, EQ was a 4 times better predictor of the success of those scientists than IQ.